Senator McPhedran on debate.
Thank you, Your Honor. Just one moment, please. I think. Sorry, I realized that my microphone had been turned down. Bonsoir, Tanzi. En tant.
Good evening. As a senator from Manitoba, I realize that I am on an Indigenous territory, the Métis Knowledge Territory too.
Surrendered lands of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin First Nations. Je voudrais citer la presse.
I would like to quote La Presse from February 19th. There is a right to demonstrate, but not a right to block the heart of the capital and threaten its democratic institutions and perturb police operations by tying up 911 lines and endangering the lives of Ottawa citizens. Some went so far as to put children between the lines of the police and demonstrators. They used their own children as human shields.
Called Freedom Convoy protests were ostensibly marked by a January 2022 regulation mandating truckers and essential workers crossing the border to provide proof of vaccination. But the truth is that these protests are less a reaction to this mandate and more a reflection of the general frustration with the pandemic-related restrictions of the last couple of years. Unfortunately, it has become increasingly apparent that these protests have been appropriated by more radical and politicized voices and elements to the disservice of the majority of protesters, and any legitimate debate has been subsumed by polemically divisive populism. It is telling to note that with 90% of truck drivers vaccinated against COVID-19, according to the Canadian Trucking Alliance, the majority of the industry is sitting out the convoy protest. The Canadian Trucking Alliance and Alliance Trucking Ontario Association has been vocal against the convoy actions and in favor of government intervention. What's more, even if the government were to immediately lift the federal vaccine mandate for truckers, a parallel U.S. vaccine mandate announced last October for foreign truckers would still keep them from crossing the border. So the cross-border vaccine mandate for essential workers is clearly symbolic rather than central to these protests. Something else is happening here. I think we can all understand and empathize with the high frustration and uncertainty that many Canadians feel regarding the pandemic. But let us also remember the many more Canadians who have lost 35,000 plus of their families and friends. Restrictions have been imposed and then lifted in ways across the country by federal and provincial governments, and they haven't always been effectively communicated. A more profound impact on our lives than we could have ever imagined. But let's be clear and let's be fair. Those same restrictions, clunky, inconvenient, and perhaps from time to time intrusive as they have been, have helped keep this country at our COVID death rate at about 1/3 proportional to the United States. Frustration is real, but so too is science. And the health policy and legislating for the good, the common good, has been relatively successful. As many have voiced already, Canadians have the privilege and right to protest and demonstrate. We see this all the time. Some are small, Some are large and organized. Most of us have participated in demonstrations from time to time. I certainly know my kids grew up from the time they were in strollers being wheeled into demonstrations. And those demonstrations were peaceful. Those demonstrations did not block anybody's right to their life or to health care or to services that are essential. However, jurisprudence has clarified that Section 2C guarantees the right to peaceful assembly. It does not protect riots or gatherings that seriously disturb the peace. Furthermore, it has been stated that the right to freedom of assembly, along with freedom of expression, does not include the right to physically impede or blockade lawful activities. We recognize and accept the necessity to balance our rights and freedoms with the rule of law in our democracy. That is the essence of Section 1 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Reasonable limits placed by a democratic process. The protests, convoys, occupations manifested across the country with the underlying issues, supposedly the coronavirus. There's a global pandemic that has to date resulted in the deaths of more than 5.9 million people. In a Canadian context, 45,000 Canadians died in World War II, and more than 35,000 Canadians have died in this pandemic so far, with more dying every day. This is an issue of public health and common good. This is an issue of peace, order, and good government, as is set out in our Constitution. Yes, there have been limits placed on Canadians, from the mandatory use of masks to limiting group sizes to limits on mobility and even on business and school closures. But that has been to reduce the spread, not eradicate the virus, because we know that isn't possible. It's been done for the common good. It's been done so that health workers can do their work for people among us who need health care. We have seen incontrovertible evidence that a combination of medical and technical interventions and equally imperative individual conscious behavioral changes are required to effectively counter this or indeed any pandemic. The impositions of COVID-related restrictions and health regulations are intended to minimize illness and death in the maximum number of Canadians, and that's exactly what vaccinations have done. But none of us has the right to behave as though it isn't important for someone else to protect their health. This is a balancing of rights and privileges and a weighing of responsible and proportionate measures to respond to this crisis. And in my opinion, the declaration on February 14th fit within the criteria necessary under the Emergencies Act on February 14th. When Alberta dropped virtually all health restrictions on July 1st, 2021, the cases skyrocketed. Albertans were dying from COVID-19 at more than 3 times the Canadian average. The province was in crisis because the provincial government did not maintain health restrictions that could have kept its citizens safe. This is an issue that is at the core of what we are struggling with here in this debate. Much of the power that has been objected to by many of the protesters actually has little to do with the federal government because of our Constitution, because of the division of powers between provinces and the federal government. This is really an analog to this current debate. Whether the invocation of this Emergencies Act is another form of unreasonable and therefore imposition of limits on our Charter of Freedoms. Yes, In my opinion, it does meet that test for proportionality and reasonableness as set out so clearly in the Oakes test by the Supreme Court of Canada. Specific to the invocation of the Emergencies Act, I am convinced by the evidence that these protests move beyond peaceful assembly, and the open demonstrations of citizens has been unfortunately hijacked by radical elements that have been using these demonstrations and continue to use fomenting the movement to ferment, infiltrate, spread, and move into areas that are potentially far more sinister. To extrapolate outwards from what we have seen in these past weeks, by which I refer to the border blockades and deliberate crippling of infrastructure, to weapon seizures and conspiracy to commit murder charges in Coutts, Alberta, to the occupation and siege of Ottawa, the documented organizational involvement of active and former military, police, as well as individuals known to have deep connections to extremist groups, publicly proclaiming that they want a racial war, publicly proclaiming that if there isn't this kind of insurrection, then, quote, we will all soon be forced to speak Hebrew, approximate quote. The intelligence assessments prepared by Canada's Integrated Terrorism Assessment Centre, ITAC, are pertinent to this discussion. They warned in late January that it was likely that extremists were involved, and they said that the scale of the protests could yet pose, quote, a trigger point, an opportunity for potential lone actor attackers to conduct a terrorist attack, end of quote. I remind you that according to Section 83 of the Criminal Code, terrorism is an act that is committed, quote, in whole or in part with the intention of intimidating the public or a segment of the public regard to its security, including its economic security, or compelling a person, a government, or a domestic or an international organization to do or to refrain from doing any act. End of quote. Could we think for a moment about the entire closure of the Rideau shopping center in downtown Ottawa as just one example? It is understood that demonstrations always tend to attract some extreme individuals and groups, but the apparent level of coordination and integration as reported by ITAC and observed by other policing and security agencies indicates clearly that this occupation has moved far from the original intentions of many of its participants. Extremist attitudes have instead infiltrated, derailed, and co-opted the original voice and intent of the majority of the protesters. This irreparably changed the convoy from a peaceful assembly to something calculated and dangerous. I want to focus my remaining remarks on some oversight and control measures provided for in the Act, in particular Section 59, which provides for only 20 members of Parliament and 10 senators to come together for an early end to the use of the declaration under the Emergencies Act, and Section 62, which mandates the parliamentary review process. On Section 62, I wish to highlight a number of facts that are troubling and which I hope we will ensure that the parliamentary inquiry will study. 1, the presence and apparent organizing leadership of active and former Canadian Armed Forces members, as well as active and former police. 2, the presence, positioning, and safety of children within the protest, and how this affected policing decisions and actions. 3, the double standard in how the police have responded to the actions of this group compared to a very different use of force and arrests at some Indigenous and climate justice protests, or indeed has been mentioned at the Toronto G20 summit. Lastly, the legitimacy, efficacy, and precision of employing financial seizures as a reasonable alternative to violence or more aggressive coercive police action. Colleagues, many people have commented on the fact that of the rather astonishing degree of peaceful dismantling of this siege. And I think we need to pay close attention to the use of the financial leverage in this way and the likelihood that this contributed to the relatively peaceful process that we saw happen in the last number of days. Thank you, colleagues.
Excuse me, Senator McPhedran, are you just about to wind up?
I am, sir.
Okay.
Yes.
Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. With grave concern about extension of the extraordinary powers, I note that the Emergency Act does not suspend civil liberties or charter rights. It ensures that the Prime Minister and Cabinet are not allowed to dictate without parliamentary oversight. Colleagues, that's why we're here. The Act requires that the declaration must be tabled in Parliament within 7 sitting days of Cabinet issuing its declaration. So in closing, may I just say, I will vote in favor of the declaration under the Emergencies Act, and I will also work with anyone who wishes across all boundaries to gather together the 20 members of Parliament and the 10 senators to begin the process of ending these extraordinary powers.